The first gunshot tore through the quiet afternoon like a knife ripping silk. Lila Booker didn't look back. Her arms clutched a small leather satchel tight against her chest, as if her very life was inside it. Papers rustling with every desperate stride. Behind her, the town of Redemption Creek drowned in smoke and screams. The Blackwell gang had stormed the bank, where she worked, and now gunfire echoed off wooden rooftops like thunder rolling through the valley. Wind carried the dust and the stench of smoke. Lila ran. She didn't think about the wound bleeding along her ribs or the tear in her blue dress where the bullet had grazed her. Only one thought pulsed in her mind: protect the evidence. The ledgers and figures that would expose Edward Haynes, the bank manager who'd once promised to marry her with sugar on his tongue. Now he was the one who wanted her dead. The pounding of hooves thundered behind her, as fierce and wild as her heartbeat. She stumbled, catching her foot on a patch of dry grass. Her breath burned. The afternoon sun pressed down, harsh and merciless. She didn't know how far she'd gone, only that every step was a battle between will and exhaustion. When she saw the creek, she nearly collapsed. The water curved around the base of a hill, clear as glass, flashing like broken mirrors under the light. Lila dropped to her knees, lips cracked, reaching for the water. Her blood-streaked hand left a red blur across the surface. A fractured breath escaped her. Not a prayer, just the sound of someone not ready to die. Then her body tilted, half in sunlight, half in shadow. Eli Carson found her at sundown. He'd been tracking a wounded deer since morning, the blood trail leading all the way to the water. But instead of an animal, he found a woman lying still among the wet grass. Her skin, deep and dark, shimmered like bronze under the last light. Her hand clutched the strap of her bag, as if even death might try to take it from her. Eli dismounted, his rifle still slung over his shoulder. Out here, caution was the only thing that kept a man alive. He nudged her shoulder gently with the barrel. No reaction. Then he heard it. Faint, fragile breathing, like a whisper fighting the wind. He dropped his gun, kneeling beside her. His rough hands turned her over, and for a moment, something in his chest caught. Her face wasn't soft or delicate. It was strong, shaped by hardship and grit. Her lashes flickered, and a faint moan escaped her lips. Eli saw the wound along her ribs: dried blood, bruised skin, the sharp smell of iron. Without thinking, he slid his arms beneath her and lifted her from the ground. She was frighteningly light, as if half her life had already slipped away. Her head fell against his chest, leaving a dark stain on his shirt. "You'll make it," he muttered, though she couldn't hear him. "You've come this far. You ain't quittin' now." He laid her across the saddle, holding her steady with one arm, then swung up behind her. His other arm wrapped firm around her, the way a man holds something he's not ready to lose. The sky deepened to violet. Stars began to rise over the ridges. He turned his horse toward the line of cottonwoods, where a small cabin hid among the trees. The night wind was cold and dry, carrying the scent of blood and dust. She breathed, faintly but steady. Her fingers twitched, brushing his forearm. A tiny movement, but it froze him. 3 years since he'd buried his wife, and not once had he let another soul this close. As the horse crossed the creek, moonlight rippled over the water, lighting his face and the dark stain spreading across her dress. Eli looked down, his jaw tight, and whispered, "Don't leave me now." She didn't answer, but her weakening hand closed around his sleeve, feeble yet certain. like a silent promise between two strangers who didn't yet know their fates were about to entwine. And so, beneath the wide western sky, a hunted woman and a lonely man rode together into the night, their breaths mixing with the wind, the beginning of a story neither of them had seen coming. Eli's cabin sat deep in the valley, hidden among whispering birch trees. By the time he carried Lila inside, the last light of day had faded. Sunset spilled through the small window, painting the rough-hewn walls in shades of rust and blood. He laid her on the wooden bed, the thick blanket smelling faintly of smoke and horsehide, then hurried to light the fire. Flames leapt and flickered across her still face, pale beneath the dust and sweat of the road. Eli shrugged off his heavy coat and washed his hands in a basin of cold water. The wound at her side was worse than he'd thought. He carefully cut away the blood-stained fabric, cleaned it with warm water, then ground a handful of dried herbs from his mother's old pouch, remedies passed down from Cherokee ancestors for wounds that couldn't afford infection. When his hand brushed her skin, the faint warmth and fragile heartbeat made him pause. Her skin, dark as burned oak, trembled under his touch. He wrapped the bandage, then slipped her into one of his shirts, too big for her frame, carrying the faint scent of old soap and solitude. Night fell hard. Wind hissed through the chinks in the roof. Soon she began to burn with fever. Her breath came in quick, uneven gasps, forehead slick with sweat, lips cracked and dry. Eli sat by her side, changing cold cloths again and again, each wrung with hands that trembled more from fear than fatigue. She muttered through her delirium, broken words tumbling from a fever dream. "Edward, don't. Please. Their money. They'll lose everything. God, don't let him find out." He listened, piecing the fragments together like shards of glass. A woman carrying a secret, a man named Edward, and something deeper than betrayal. Eli sighed. He replaced the cloth on her brow. The lantern light flickered across her skin, the bronze glow of her cheeks, the damp curls clinging to her neck. The firelight turned her sweat into tiny beads of gold, like dew trapped on hot stone. "You've got to make it," he murmured, voice rough and low. "Don't let go now. Folks who give up out here never see the sunrise." She couldn't hear him, yet her hand twitched, searching blindly for something. He took it, his calloused palm closing around hers. Her hand was small, burning hot, trembling like flame. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Lila, stay with me." He said it again and again, through the long hours of darkness, until it became something between a prayer and a promise. Outside, wind howled through the pines, but inside there was only the crackle of fire and the fragile rhythm of her breath. Between those silences, Eli remembered. His wife, Nora, had once lain in that same bed, fevered and gasping, and he hadn't been able to save her. Her death had sealed him off from the world. He'd built fences not just for his land, but for his heart. He'd sworn never to care again. And yet here he was, watching a stranger fight for her life, feeling that same old terror stirring in his chest, the kind that comes only when something starts to matter again. By midnight, her fever peaked. She shivered violently, breath breaking apart in fits. Eli lifted her, held her steady, pressing water to her lips, whispering close to her ear, "Don't you quit. I'm right here." Firelight caught in his eyes, dark, still, and endless as a fall lake. An hour later, her breathing softened. Sweat dampened her collar, her pulse steadied. Eli replaced the cloth one last time, then sat back against the post, exhausted, unwilling to sleep. Outside, the world had quieted. Moonlight slid through the cracks, tracing a thin silver line across her hair. Eli watched her for a long while, this hunted woman with secrets carved into her skin, and saw, for the first time in years, proof that courage hadn't vanished from the earth. When dawn's first light crept through the shutters, he bowed his head beside the bed, her hand still in his. Half dreaming, half awake, he heard a whisper, faint as wind through grass. "Don't go." He opened his eyes. She was still alive, and for reasons he couldn't name. That simple fact hurt like something inside him had just been brought back to life. Morning came clear over the valley, the kind of light that follows a hard night. The air smelled of damp earth and wet wood. A breeze slipped through the small cabin window, stirring the wick of an oil lamp gone cold. Lila opened her eyes slowly, seeing the low, timbered ceiling, the gray boards, and the quiet bubbling of a kettle over the fire. Everything felt strange and gentle at once, so peaceful she thought it might be a dream. But when she tried to move, pain flared sharp at her side, real and deep, pulling a soft moan from her lips. Eli turned from the stove where he'd been stirring a pot of medicine. The morning light caught his face, carving shadows along his jaw, setting his dark brown eyes aglow like earth after rain. "You're awake," he said, voice low and hoarse from a sleepless night. "Don't try to sit up." Lila nodded faintly. She felt the loose cotton shirt against her skin, clean, soft, and scented faintly of soap and smoke. He must have changed her clothes while she was unconscious. Her cheeks burned, but her voice stayed calm. "Thank you. If it weren't for you, I'd be dead out there." Eli didn't answer right away. He brought her a small cup of tea, steam curling upward. "Drink this. Bitter, but it'll keep the fever down." She took it carefully. The tea was dark and earthy, its bitterness pulling her back to full awareness. She looked around the small cabin, hides hanging on the walls, a rough wooden table, an old rifle resting by the door. No trace of a woman's touch. The quiet warmth of the room told her what she already knew. This was a man who lived alone. "You saved me," she said softly. "But if they find me here, you'll be in danger too." Eli sat down in the chair beside her, fingers laced together. "They?" Lila drew a slow breath, as if steadying herself before crossing back into memory. "Edward Haynes, the bank manager I worked for. He's tied up with the Blackwell gang. They've been forging ledgers, stealing from the townspeople, widows, farmers, even the church. I found the records, and I kept the proof." Eli studied her quietly. No shock in his eyes, only the patience of a man who's heard too many hard stories. "He wants you dead?" "Yes. The whole gang's after me. I only had time to grab the ledgers and a few documents. If they get them back, everything those folks worked for will vanish." He nodded, slow and steady, gaze heavy but without judgment. "You did right. But out here, doing right and staying alive don't often go hand in hand." A faint smile crossed her lips. "I know, but silence would have been worse. I couldn't live with that." Her words settled deep in the room. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the distant cry of a grouse carried through the valley. Both of them, the hunted woman and the man who'd stopped believing, understood that silence, too, could be a kind of sin. Eli rose to so, pour her another cup. You need to eat. Made some corn porridge. She started to refuse, but hunger betrayed her. He set the bowl before her and sat across the table. They ate in quiet. Only the clink of spoons and the soft crackle of fire filled the space. Morning light slid through the window, glinting off her curls and the bronze hue of her skin. Eli caught her gaze for a fleeting moment, then looked away, unsettled by the warmth that filled the small cabin. He'd grown used to solitude, but her presence made the silence feel alive. Lila set her spoon down and looked at him. Why did you help me? You don't know me. You owe me nothing. Eli's hands tightened. He kept his eyes on the table. Maybe because I was the only one there. He paused, voice softening. Or maybe because I can't stand to see someone die when I could have done something. Out here, there's not much goodness left. I try to hold on to what little I can. Lila was quiet a long while. Then she said, almost in a whisper, You still have goodness, Eli. That's something they can't steal. They stayed like that through the long morning. Two strangers bound by silence more honest than words. When the light tilted across the floor, catching the gold in her hair and the roughness of his hands, the space between them no longer felt uncertain. She lifted her cup once more. The tea was still bitter, but this time, it went down easy. That night, the moon hung low over the ridge, so bright it silvered every blade of grass, heavy with dew. The air was thick with silence, the kind that pressed against a man's chest and wouldn't let him rest. Eli hadn't slept. Something had felt wrong since dusk. Strange boot prints near the stable, a few broken branches that hadn't been there that morning. Out here, nothing ever just happened. He pulled on his coat, took his rifle, and stepped out onto the porch. The hinges groaned, a small sound, but sharp in the stillness. His shadow stretched long across the pale ground as his eyes scanned the trees, every muscle alert. Through the crack of the door, Lila watched him. The moonlight washed over his tall frame, steady, quiet, a man who'd learned to stand between danger and whatever he chose to protect. The gun in his hand glinted coldly, the hem of his coat lifting with each passing gust like the wing of a restless bird. Lila bit her lip. Every instinct warned her that trouble was close. Yet what she felt wasn't fear. It was something heavier, deeper, something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Since betrayal and flight, trust had become a dead thing. But watching Eli in the moonlight, she understood. Sometimes trust doesn't need to be given. Sometimes it finds its way back on its own. A soft crack, a twig breaking. Eli turned, rifle raised. He heard quick breathing, the scrape of gravel, then silence. A barn owl swept overhead, wings beating hard against the dark. The valley fell quiet again. He stayed out until dawn, when mist began to fall in pale beads across the porch. Lila opened the door softly. You didn't sleep at all? Eli shook his head. Found tracks near the barn. They might have followed the blood trail. She shivered. If it's the Blackwell gang, then they'll be here by morning, he said evenly, though his eyes never left the tree line. And sure enough, as the sun crested the pines, hoofbeats broke the silence. 3 riders emerged from the trail, long coats, guns at their sides. Dust rose around them, sunlight flashing off polished silver. Eli shut the door halfway and spoke low. Stay inside. Bolt the windows. Unless I call, You don't show yourself. Lila nodded, though her chest tightened. She didn't want to hide anymore. She couldn't. The riders pulled up in front of the porch. "Open up, Carson," one called, voice rough and lazy. "We're looking for a woman. Colored, thin, might be hurt. Heard you've got a soft heart." Eli swung the door open and stepped out. "Morning, gentlemen. Ain't nobody here but me and a few head of cattle. What's your business?" The leader smirked. "Small matter, if you're telling the truth." The air thickened. A lone bird cut across the clearing, cried once, then vanished. Eli's fingers flexed on the rifle. He wouldn't shoot unless forced, but he was ready, a heartbeat, passed. Then another. "We'll just take a look around," the man said, grin widening. "You don't mind, do you?" "I do," Eli replied, voice flat as iron. "This is my land. I don't take visitors." The second man spat, hand drifting toward his gun. In that split second, Eli fired. The crack split the morning wide open. The man fell from his horse, cursing, clutching his shoulder. The other two drew and ducked for cover behind the porch posts. Inside, Lila trembled. Through the window, she saw Eli drop low, fire back. A bullet tore through his sleeve, blood spreading fast. Her gaze fell on the pistol lying on the table. Her hands shook, but her eyes hardened. She opened the window, lifted the gun with both hands. Her heart hammered, but when she saw one of the men creeping toward the back of the cabin, fear burned away, leaving only resolve. She pulled the trigger. The shot rang sharp. The bullet clipped the man's hat clean off, making him stumble and curse. Eli seized the opening, fired once more, and hit him in the shoulder. The last rider yanked his partner upright, spurred his horse, and vanished into a rising cloud of dust. Silence returned, broken only by the whinny of horses and the bitter smell of gunpowder. Eli stepped inside, arm bleeding. Lila stood by the window, gun still trembling in her grip. Their eyes met, and in that smoky air, no words were needed. Between the blood, the smoke, and the echo of fading gunfire, they both knew. What bound them now was more than gratitude. It was trust, tested and forged in fire. Eli let out a weary breath, easing into a chair. "Good shot," he murmured. Lila's voice shook, but her eyes were steady. "My father taught me. Said if you don't pull the trigger when you're cornered, you'll never live long enough to learn." Eli nodded. He was right. Outside, the sun rose over the ridge, its light spilling across the blood on the floorboards. Warm, relentless, and alive. A reminder that from this moment on, neither of them would face the world alone. The cabin still smelled of gunpowder, a mix of blood, smoke, and wood fire hanging in the air. Eli sat slouched on the bench, his shoulder torn, the fabric darkened with fresh blood. Lila brought a basin of warm water to his side, her hands still trembling slightly, though her eyes were steadier than they had ever been. "Let me help you," she said softly. "No need. It's just a scratch." "You can't see the back of your shoulder," she replied. Quiet, but firm. He looked at her, about to argue, then stopped. When she leaned close, the lamp's glow brushed across her face, bronze skin gleaming like warm metal, eyes deep and bright as though holding the night itself. She wrung the cloth. Water dripped rhythmically onto the wooden floor. Her fingers touched his skin. The sensation made Eli tighten his fist, not from pain, but from something else entirely. Warmth, life, the shock of closeness after too long in solitude. "Aren't you afraid?" she asked, her voice low, cutting through the stillness. "3 men with guns, and you faced them alone." Eli gave a faint smile. "I was afraid, but if I hadn't stepped out, you'd be dead. And I'm tired of watching people die when I could have done something." Lila froze, eyes lifting to him. "You've watched that before?" He was silent for a moment before exhaling. "My wife. She died of typhoid 3 years ago. I stayed with her, did everything I could, but it wasn't enough. After that, I left town. Folks said I was running. Maybe they were right." His voice was gravel low, not trembling, but heavy with what he didn't say. Lila sat beside him, the damp cloth still in her hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have asked." "It's all right," he said. "You're the first person I've spoken to in months." A long silence followed. The only sound was the faint crackle of firewood. Then, the first drops of spring rain began to fall. Soft at first, tapping on the roof like a heartbeat finding rhythm again. Lila bent forward, binding the wound carefully, wrapping the strip of cloth across his shoulder. When she tightened the knot, his chest rose and fell. The space between them closed until he could feel her breath, steady, warm, carrying the faint scent of bitter tea. "And you?" he asked quietly. "Before all this, what did you dream of?" She smiled faintly, her eyes drifting toward the misty window. "I dreamed of opening a small shop, teaching children to read. My mother never learned, and I promised her I'd help others like her, people who got cheated because they couldn't read the words that trapped them. But life rarely walks the path we plan." Eli studied her, her calm defiance, the light still burning behind tired eyes. "You've got a heart that doesn't know how to quit, Lila." She turned back, smiling softly. "And you've got hands that don't know how to let go." They both laughed, not loud, just enough to loosen the weight in the air. For the first time since meeting, their laughter was unguarded, clean of pain or fear. She set the basin aside and sat beside him again, close enough that the sound of their breathing filled the quiet. Outside, the rain thickened, drumming on the roof in a wild, uneven rhythm. Eli glanced at her hands. Long fingers, faint scars, stories in every line. "You've had to fight for yourself, haven't you?" "In the place I was born," she said. "A black woman doesn't get many choices. If I hadn't fought, I'd have been swallowed whole long ago." He nodded, eyes shadowed. "So we've both lost to our pasts, but somehow we're still here. And sharing supper in a house without locks," she added, her voice like smoke. Eli let out a weary, honest laugh. He poured more tea and slid the cup toward her. "To the ones who survive," he said. Lila lifted her cup, their eyes meeting through the rising steam. That night, they talked until the fire burned low, about the places they'd left behind, the people they'd lost, the things too fragile to speak of until now. When silence finally came, they didn't fill it. They didn't need to. In the small cabin, rain fell steady on the roof, and 2 breaths found the same rhythm. Between fire and rain, 2 souls that had wandered alone too long found, at last, a place to rest. The sky split open that evening. The storm rolled in from the west, dragging thunder and wind like 2 beasts locked in a fight that had no peace to make. Gusts struck the roof, rattling the boards, filling the air with the scent of wet earth and lightning. Eli and Lila had already brought the animals in, barred the windows, and stacked sand by the door, but the rain still found its way in, tracing long silver streaks down the walls, dripping steadily onto the wooden floor. The hearth was the only light left, glowing small and golden, a lone heartbeat inside the storm. She wrapped herself in a blanket and sat close to the fire. The glow turned her dark skin to polished bronze, her eyes catching every flicker like mirrors of the flame. Eli sat opposite, back against the wall, a cup of cold tea in his hand. Neither spoke. Only the sound of rain drumming on the roof and wind sweeping past the door filled the silence. It was so quiet she could hear her own breath, and beneath it, the slow, steady beat of his heart. The rain grew harder. A piece of tin tore loose, sending a spill of water through the ceiling. Eli rose quickly, setting a bucket beneath the leak, but the floor was already slick. He turned to her with a crooked smile. "Guess we've got ourselves some music." She laughed softly, her voice mingling with the thunder. A flash of lightning cut through the window, painting both their faces, scars, weariness, and something else neither dared to name. Eli sat beside her, and the blanket stretched to cover them both. His warmth seeped through the wool, the faint scent of tobacco and sun-baked leather hanging around him. Strange, familiar, human. Rain poured harder, thunder rolled, but within that small space there was only the rhythm of two hearts learning the same beat. "Think it'll clear by morning?" she asked. "Maybe. Storms here come fast and leave fast, like most things." "Not everything," she said, eyes fixed on the flame. "Some things arrive slow and stay longer than we expect." Eli looked at her. In the firelight, her face seemed carved from shadow and glow, her features soft yet sure. He couldn't remember the last time he'd looked at someone that long. The storm seemed to draw the world tighter around them. A drop slid from the roof onto her neck, making her flinch. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Her skin was cool, and for a moment, his only thought was to keep it warm. Neither spoke. Outside, thunder swallowed the world, leaving only the hush inside. Lila turned slightly, her breath brushing his collarbone. Firelight danced on the blanket, on the hands that found each other in quiet understanding. There was no rush, no hunger, only two souls worn thin by loss, finding shelter in one another. He pressed his lips to her forehead, a small, careful gesture, but it stopped the air between them. She lifted her eyes, wide and searching, not yielding, not resisting. And then, as thunder softened into rain, she leaned forward. The kiss came slow, trembling, tender, like hands finding their way through the dark. The cabin fell still, save for the rain mingling with their breath. The walls that had divided them, of race, of grief, of fear, dissolved in the warmth of touch and trust. Lila rested her palm over his chest, feeling the strong, unhurried pulse beneath sun-worn skin. "Why are you still kind to me, after everything?" she whispered. Eli didn't answer right away. His gaze met hers, steady as flame after a storm. "Because I thought I'd been dead a long time," he said quietly. "Until tonight." Outside, the thunder drifted away, leaving only the soft, steady rain. She rested her head on his shoulder, her breath melting into the rhythm of his heartbeat. When morning came, the sky was pale and fragile, stretched like a clean white sheet. Light streamed through the window, settling on her skin, warm, calm, as if the storm had never been. Eli woke to find her asleep against him, curls resting on his shoulder. He murmured so low it was almost a thought, "I'd forgotten what it feels like to be alive." She didn't answer, only shifted closer in her sleep. Outside, the storm had passed, but in that small cabin, something new had begun. Quiet, nameless, and true. 3 days after the storm, the sky was clear and the ground still damp. The young sun shimmered across the valley, glinting on puddles that dotted the trail like bits of broken glass. The pain along Lila's ribs had eased. The wound healing beneath clean bandages Eli changed each morning. But he knew, as long as the Blackwell gang roamed free, this place was no longer safe. That morning, he sat at the table, a map spread wide before him, his calloused finger tracing the narrow road curling through the mountains toward Cheyenne. "The marshal's office is there," he said, voice rough. "If you can get those papers to them, this will end. You'll be under protection, Lila." She looked at him for a long time. "And you?" "I'll take you there, then come back. I belong to this land. You deserve a new start." Something caught in her throat, a thin wire of ache she couldn't name, but she didn't argue. She understood that sometimes kindness comes wrapped in distance, built not from indifference, but from fear of losing something unnamed. That night, they left the cabin. The air smelled of wet soil and grass, the sound of crickets rising from the fields. Hank, Eli's old friend, a broad-shouldered cowboy with a booming laugh, was waiting outside with a small freight wagon. "We're headed to Cheyenne with supplies," he said, glancing from Lila to Eli with a grin that carried more understanding than words. "That girl's got luck, Eli." Eli didn't reply. He only nodded and helped Lila onto the horse, his hand brushing her back. The thin fabric beneath his fingers sent a jolt through him. When she turned, their eyes met, just for a heartbeat. But it was enough to feel the whole sky tilt between them. The convoy started moving. Wagon wheels crushed the damp earth, horses snorted, leather creaked. Above them stretched a vast dome of stars, endless and quiet. The road wound through open country, moonlight spilling across their shoulders like pale silk. Lila wore Eli's coat, the faint smell of smoke and rain clinging to it. She pulled it tighter around her and began to sing, softly at first, almost as if her voice belonged to the wind. Then the melody deepened, slow and mournful, without pleading, only remembering. "My mother used to sing that," she murmured when Eli glanced her way. "She said whenever I was scared I should sing, because the sky always listens." Eli said nothing. He'd never believed in prayers, but her voice quieted something in him. Each note fell from her lips like starlight. Fragile, unguarded, real. Up ahead, Hank turned in his saddle and called, "That's a fine song, miss. Haven't heard a sound that sweet in a month's ride." Lila smiled shyly, lowering her gaze. "It only means something at night," she said. Eli didn't speak again, but when she reached the final verse, that long, trembling note fading into the wind, something in him clenched. There was a truth in her voice that made him remember everything he'd lost, and still, somehow, want to believe in what could last. They stopped by a creek at midnight. Lila dismounted, her boots sinking into soft grass, her breath misting in the cool air. Eli stepped behind her and laid a blanket over her shoulders. "You're cold," he said quietly. "So are you," she replied with a small smile. They sat beside the fire. Around them, the others were silent. The only sounds, the horses grazing and the wind drifting low across the valley. The flames flickered in their eyes. Two strangers bound by something still forming, something both heavy and tender. After a long while, Eli spoke. His voice was low, thoughtful. I used to think I'd never leave that place again. But now I see. There are people who can make a man go farther than he ever meant to. Lila met his gaze, her eyes gleaming with warmth. And some roads only open when two people walk them together. They both smiled, soft, fleeting, real. Far across the ridges, a lone wolf howled into the night. But for that moment, there was only the rhythm of the horses, the crackle of fire, and the road ahead, leading them toward Cheyenne, toward justice, and perhaps toward a kind of faith they had yet to name. The trail up Coleman Pass was so narrow, two horses couldn't ride side by side without leaning into the cliff. Clouds sank low, swallowing the peaks, and the fog lay over the mountain like a shroud of mourning. Wind whistled through the stone, an eerie voice somewhere between breath and warning. Eli rode ahead, Lila behind him, with Hank and two ranch hands guarding the flanks. They'd been on the move for 2 days through the valley and were only half a day from Cheyenne. Yet Eli couldn't shake the quickening in his chest, a tightening in the air that whispered something was waiting for them. We ought to rest a bit, Hank muttered. Horses are wearing down. Eli nodded. They stopped on a flat stretch carved into the mountainside, the cliff dropping off sheer beneath them. One wrong step and they'd vanish into the mist. Lila dismounted, stretching, her hand brushing the half-healed scar along her ribs. She wasn't fully recovered, but every mile beside him had made her feel stronger. Eli glanced back at her, a small smile ghosting across his lips. You holding up? I've survived worse than mountains, she said, her breath fading into the fog. He was about to answer when a crack split the air, sharp, dry, final. A bullet tore across his shoulder, spraying red into the white mist. Ambush! Hank roared. The echo bounced off the rocks like thunder. Gunfire erupted from both sides of the ridge, flashing in the haze. Horses screamed, bullets struck stone in sparks. Eli grabbed Lila and pulled her down behind a boulder. His jaw tightened as he chambered his Winchester. Stay down! You're bleeding, she cried. I'm fine, Another bullet hit the rock beside his head, showering them with fragments. From the ridge above came a voice, hollow, taunting, too familiar. Through the drifting smoke, Lila saw him. Tall, gaunt, dressed in black, eyes the color of ash. Edward Haynes. Lila, he called, his words curling in the wind. Don't make this harder. Hand over those papers and I'll let you live. Lila's grip tightened on her pistol. Her eyes burned bright. Live? She whispered. He doesn't know what that means. Eli shifted beside her, and then she saw the blood pooling through his sleeve. He sagged against the rock. No. She caught him before he fell. His breath came shallow, skin cold beneath her hands. Don't close your eyes, she said, voice trembling. He tried to speak, his words a rasp. Go, Lila. Don't let them take you. She shook her head fiercely. Not this time. I'm done running. She dragged him backward, inch by inch, toward a narrow crack in the cliff wall. His weight was heavy, but she didn't stop. Sweat and blood slicked her hands, and every step felt carved out of pain. When they reached the shelter, she lowered him carefully, tearing a strip from her dress to press against the wound. "Eli, look at me," she whispered urgently. "You told me that night, remember? Stay with me. Now it's my turn." Outside, the gunfire raged like hail on stone, but in that hidden hollow, there was only the ragged sound of breathing. Her hands shook as she tied the bandage, but her voice stayed firm. "Do you hear me? I won't let you die. Not while I'm still breathing." Eli's eyelids fluttered open, his voice faint as smoke. "You're crazy." She laughed through her tears, her hand pressed over his heart. "Maybe, but if madness is what it takes, then I'll take it." Outside, Hank and the others fought back, the clash of bullets and hooves echoing down the pass. Lila bent low, pulling Eli's coat over his chest, shielding him from the cold. "Can you hear me?" she asked again. He gave a small nod, lips moving soundlessly. She gripped his hand tight, tighter than fear, tighter than fate, and repeated like a vow, "Stay with me." Wind screamed through the rocks, carrying the smell of gunpowder and blood. But in Lila's eyes, the fire hadn't gone out. The woman who'd once fled through storms and shadows was now the one standing between death and the man she loved. Eli's body went limp, his head tilting against the stone, but for once he wasn't the protector. Thunder rolled in the distance, blending with the roar of gunfire, as if the sky itself had chosen a side. In the dark, damp hollow, Lila bent close, whispering the words that had once saved her, her voice deep and steady as a promise renewed. "Stay with me, Eli, just this once. I'll be the one to keep you in this world." By morning, fog smothered the whole of Coleman Pass. The gunfire had stopped, leaving only silence, thick and uneasy, like fear that hadn't yet faded. Hank and the two ranch hands had split off to mislead the Blackwell gang. Lila stayed behind in the narrow crevice with Eli, who still hadn't woken. His breathing came fast and heavy. She laid a hand on his forehead. His skin burned like fire. Outside, the sun had yet to rise, and the mist was so dense she wouldn't have seen a rider, even if one stood 20 feet away. Lila held her breath, listening to every sound, the fall of pebbles, the distant snort of a horse somewhere in the fog, and then a voice she knew too well, smooth as oil, cold as betrayal. "I didn't think I'd have to come find you myself, Lila." She spun around. Edward Haynes stood at the mouth of the crevice, his black coat soaked in dew, a silver revolver gleaming in his hand. Behind him, two surviving Blackwell men waited, smirking like they'd already won. "You look better than I expected," Edward said, his tone dripping mockery. "Heard you found yourself a hero to save that poor, ruined life of yours." Lila stood between him and Eli, her face hard as stone. "I don't need a hero," she said quietly. "Just a good man." Edward laughed, sharp and cruel. "Good men don't last out here, darling. You're still the same fool you were back at the bank, believing in justice, in decency. It's that faith that cost you everything." She didn't answer. Her hand tightened on the Colt Eli had taught her to use. The memory of that storm-lit night, his voice saying, "Stay with me," rose inside her like a pulse. "You're right," she said, her voice steady and low. "You took everything from me, but not this time." Edward's smile thinned. "You don't have it in you to pull that trigger. Try me." They faced each other, fog swirling between them, the metallic taste of blood still in the air. The first pale light of dawn caught her face, her eyes deep and dark, steady as the earth beneath her boots. Edward smirked, raising his gun. Goodbye, little dreamer. A single shot rang out, but it wasn't hers. Edward froze, confusion flickering before pain took its place. He looked down, a dark bloom of blood spreading across his coat. His head turned slowly toward the figure slumped against the rocks behind Lila. Eli Carson, pale as ash, hand trembling around a small derringer he'd kept hidden in his boot. "You," Edward gasped, stumbling. "You should have been dead." Eli's voice was barely more than gravel. "You should have stopped at the first betrayal." Edward collapsed, his gun falling from his grasp. His eyes stayed open, staring at the gray sky as his body slid against the stone. The two remaining Blackwell men panicked, spurred their horses, and vanished into the fog. Then came quiet, a heavy, final kind of quiet. Lila turned and rushed to Sopwang, Eli's side. He sat slumped, breath ragged, blood seeping through the old bandage. She knelt beside him, gripping his hand tight. "Eli, you shouldn't have done that." "It's all right," he whispered, forcing a weak smile. "He can't hurt anyone now." Tears slipped down her cheeks, warm and real, not from fear but from the release that follows years of running. She pulled him close and resting her forehead against his. His breathing was faint, but steady. "You told me once, stay with me, remember?" She whispered through the tremor in her voice. "Now it's my turn." Eli's lips moved faintly, a whisper caught between breath and pain. "I'm still here." A gust swept through the pass, catching Edward's cloak and dragging his lifeless body down the rocks. The sky brightened, a thin blade of sunlight cutting through the fog and falling on them. Two figures, bruised, bloodied, but alive. Lila tightened her grip on his hand. "It's over," she murmured, her voice shaking like wind through grass. "All of it." Eli's head tipped toward her shoulder, his eyes half closed. The morning light spread across his face, revealing a worn but peaceful smile. Neither spoke again. The only sound was the quiet rhythm of two hearts still beating, slow, heavy, but alive. And in Lila's arms, Eli exhaled softly, surrendering to the safety of being saved, for the first time in his life. The sound of hooves echoed through the fog like distant drums. Lila lifted her head, still clutching Eli's shoulder. Down the pass, shapes began to form, soldiers on horseback, the American flag hanging heavy with rain. A man at the front raised his hand and shouted, "U.S. Army! Anyone injured?" She staggered to her feet, waving her arm, her voice breaking. "Here! We're here!" As the soldiers approached, they found Eli slumped in her arms, his shirt stiff with dried blood, his face pale but breathing. Lila nearly collapsed herself, hollow from exhaustion, yet her eyes still burned bright, the same stubborn light that refused to go out. "We need a doctor," she said, her hands trembling as she held him tighter. Captain Harris dismounted, knelt beside Eli, and felt for a pulse. "He's alive. Get them to Fort Russell, now." The journey down the mountain was long and cruel. In the army wagon, Lila sat beside him, her hand never leaving his, feeling the faint pulse beneath the chill of his skin. The wheels groaned over dirt roads toward Cheyenne, past sun-scorched plains, creeks swollen with meltwater, and patches of pine standing like sentinels. Overhead, the sky lightened, a thin streak of pink unfurling at the edge of dawn. By the time they reached the fort, Eli was barely conscious. Medics carried him away to the infirmary. The door shut behind them, leaving Lila in the hall, her dress stained with dust and blood. The smell of carbolic and rust filled her lungs until she swayed. A nurse guided her to another room to tend her wounds, but she only nodded, her thoughts still on the other side of that door. She didn't leave it all night. When the doctor finally emerged, weary but calm, he said softly, "He's got a chance." It was the first time in days she allowed herself to breathe. 3 days passed. Eli remained unconscious, his face ashen, his breath faint as thread. Lila never left his side. Her hand stayed wrapped around his, rough, calloused, familiar, the kind of hand you could trust your life to. She spoke to him as though her voice might lead him back. She told him about her mother, the woman who used to sing her to sleep on stormy nights. She recited the small verses her mother loved, her voice quiet, slow, steady as prayer. Some live to find freedom, some live to keep faith. And if the day should come we lose each other, remember, love is still home. Each time she spoke, she bent and pressed a kiss to the back of his hand. The tears no longer came. There was only stillness and faith. On the third night, when exhaustion finally pulled at her eyes, Eli stirred. His breath hitched, a soft groan escaping his throat. Lila sat up at once, her heart hammering. "Eli?" Her voice trembled. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly, dazed at first, then clear. He saw her face hollowed from sleepless nights, her lashes wet with fatigue. His lips cracked, voice hoarse as ahang, gravel. "You stayed." She laughed through her tears, the sound of relief breaking open inside her. "I stayed," she whispered, squeezing his hand tight. "There's nowhere else I belong." He looked at her for a long time, so long the rest of the world seemed to fade. The sterile air, the muted hum of soldiers outside, even the morning light creeping through the slats of the window. It all folded into a single truth. They were alive and they were not alone. Eli closed his eyes again, the corners of his mouth softening. "Thank you," he breathed. "You don't need to," she murmured. "You saved me first." "Maybe," he whispered, "but you're the one who saved me from myself." Lila lowered her forehead to his hand. Outside, the bugle called the morning watch. Sunlight spilled through the window, glinting off the white sheets, slowly tracing its way toward their joined hands. In that quiet moment, Lila knew their running had ended. Not because the enemy was gone, but because they had found where to stop. A place without fear. A place without loneliness. A place in each other's arms. 2 months had passed since that dawn at Fort Russell. Summer had rolled over the plains in a soft gold haze, and the fields around Cheyenne thrummed once more with the sound of horses and wagon wheels. The Blackwell gang was captured. Edward Haynes lay dead on Coleman Pass, and the ledgers Lila had risked her life to carry had become the very proof that made the territory face itself in the mirror. She stood in the courtroom that day, dressed in a simple dark blue gown, her hair pinned neatly, her face calm and unreadable. When the judge pronounced the verdict, the room erupted, but Lila only closed her eyes. Not out of triumph, but release. At last, it was over. Afterward, offers came. A banker from Denver wanted her as his new chief accountant. generous pay, fine conditions. A clerk from Cheyenne invited her to teach bookkeeping to young women. But Lila only smiled, thanking them politely. To her, those offers looked like polished doors leading into rooms without warmth. That evening, as she stepped out of the courthouse, she saw Eli waiting in the yard. His shoulder had healed, though the scar still marked him. The wind carried the scent of hay and dust, tugging at the scarf around her neck. When he caught sight of her, his smile lit like sunlight bending over the far ridge. "It's done?" he asked. "All done," she said softly. "Every bit of it." They said nothing more. Side by side, they walked down the dirt road leading out of town, where Eli had tethered his horse. Passers-by tipped their hats as they went. The story of the black woman who brought a gang of outlaws to justice had already traveled across Wyoming. But Lila didn't care for talk. All she wanted was the hand holding hers, solid, warm, real. When they reached the old homestead, the land was much as it had been, quiet, untamed. Yet something had changed. It felt mended, as if the earth itself had learned how to trust again. The cabin Eli rebuilt after the storm stood strong now, its roof newly shingled, the air carrying the scent of pine and smoke. That evening, the sun sank low, casting their shadows long across the ground. They sat together on the porch, watching the horses grazing in the open field. Lila leaned against a post, her fingers folded in her lap. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her heart was steady, the rhythm of a life that had finally found its pace. Eli rose, stepped inside, and returned with a small wooden box. Holding it in both hands, he walked toward her. A faint smile caught in the amber light. "I once thought," he began quietly, "that I'd never trust anything lasting again. Then you came into my life, not with a smile, but with courage and blood." He opened the box, and inside lay a simple ring, a pale gray pearl set in worn gold. "This was my mother's," he said. "My father gave it to her when they had nothing but two bare hands and a roof they'd built themselves. She used to tell me pearls are born from pain. That's why they shine the longest." Then he knelt. No ceremony, no crowd, just the whisper of wind through dry grass and the last light of day falling over them. "Lila Booker," he said, his voice steady as carved stone. "I don't have much to offer, only this land and my heart, if you'll take it." She looked down at him, her lips trembling. "Eli, I don't want to be your burden." He shook his head, eyes gentle and sure. "You're not my burden, Lila. You're my reason." The words broke something loose inside her. Tears welled up and fell freely. She reached for him, her voice shaking. "Are you certain? The road with me won't be easy." He smiled, slow, quiet, true. "I've weathered enough storms to know what's worth keeping always costs something." The sun slipped below the ridge. Gold turned to amber, amber to violet, then faded to dusk. Lila nodded faintly and held out her hand. Eli slid the ring onto her finger, his hand trembling, not from doubt, but from feeling. She leaned her forehead against his and whispered, "Then let's stay." He smiled, his breath brushing her cheek, "Until the sunset's end." On the hill beyond the cabin, the last light poured across the fields, where two souls once lost now found each other again. Not through miracles, but through the quiet, hard-won peace they'd made with their own hands. Years passed, and the land around Coleman Pass was no longer spoken of in fear. The fields turned gold each harvest season, cattle lowed across the valleys, and the creek, where everything began, ran clearer now, gentler, as though it too had been forgiven. Their cabin stood halfway up a sunlit slope, where morning light poured through the windows in golden stripes. Lila opened the shutters, letting the scent of bread and damp earth mingle in the air. Outside, Eli was fixing the fence line, his sun-worn hands steady, the silver at his temples catching the light. Their son Samuel played among the haystacks, laughter ringing bright through the open space. Every time he laughed, Eli looked up and caught Lila's gaze through the window. They didn't need words, only that quiet look, full of life. That afternoon, Lila taught the boy to read. She traced the letters on an old wooden slate Eli had built. Samuel copied carefully, his lips moving as he wrote, "Stay." She smiled. "Good, Sam. That word's important." "Why, Mama?" "Because it means to stay, even when it's hard, even when there's storm or sun." The boy didn't fully understand, but her eyes had already wandered, back to that night of rain, to the creek that once ran red, to the man who'd held her while thunder rolled across the sky. That summer, the creek swelled after a long rain. When Samuel was asleep, Lila and Eli sat together on the porch. The moonlight shimmered over the water, and a soft wind carried the scent of grass and pine. The current whispered like a memory that refused to fade. "Do you remember the first time we met?" she asked, her gaze following the glint of the stream. Eli's smile came slow. "How could I forget? You were lying by that creek, soaked to the bone. Your breathing was so faint I thought my heart had stopped too. And what did you say to me then?" He tilted his head, pretending to think. "I said, 'Stay with me.'" She laughed softly. "And you kept your word." They fell silent, listening to the sound of water moving through the night. Fireflies blinked across the grass, like tiny stars fallen to earth. Far off, the cattle shifted in their stalls, a low hum of life against the stillness. Eli reached for her hand. His fingers, calloused and strong, met her smooth palm, and she closed around them. The fit of something that had waited its whole life to belong. "You know," she said, her voice quiet, "people still tell stories about this creek, about a black woman who ran from death, and the man who sat beside her all night in the rain." Eli smiled faintly. "Let them tell it. Just hope they remember. She lived not because someone saved her, but because she refused to give up." Lila nodded. "Then let them tell both sides, one who stayed and one who learned how." The clouds drifted apart, revealing a thin silver moon. Lila leaned into him, breathing in the faint scent of smoke and pine that always lingered on his skin. She whispered, barely more than wind, "Stay with me." Eli turned, his fingers tightening gently around hers. The moonlight caught his face. The lines softened, the eyes peaceful, the years kind. "Always," he said, simple as breath, steady as truth. The night wind carried the scent of grass, water, and a life fully lived. The creek flowed past their feet, carrying moonlight and memory, but never the promise. They say in the plains of Wyoming, there's a stream that remembers. And if you stand by it on a quiet night, You might hear a whisper in the breeze, a woman's voice saying, "Stay with me," and a man's voice answering, soft and sure, "Always." As the silver moon hung over the rolling hills, its reflection trembled on the creek, the place where everything began, and the place where it all came home. Lila and Eli needed no grand vows, no audience. They had each other, and the small world they'd built with trembling hands and brave hearts. Here, love was not fire, it was warmth. Quiet, enduring, enough to outlast even the coldest years. Their story reminds us that the most beautiful things aren't in beginnings or endings, but in the staying, the middle ground where people choose to remain when it would be easier to leave. And if this story of Lila and Eli stirs something in you, if it makes you remember the hand that once held yours through a storm, leave a thought below, a memory, a prayer. If you cherish gentle tales like this, these Wild West love stories told with kindness and memory, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in quiet love. Because somewhere out there, the creeks still remember names, and people like you and me are still learning how to stay together until the sunsets end.